In the hushed, chandelier-lit sitting room of the Fairmont Crest estate, where secrets have a way of clinging to the velvet drapes and the silence feels heavier than any confession, Leslie stands frozen with her back to Dante, her fingers trembling as they brush the edge of a polished mahogany table, her mind already frayed from weeks of unanswered questions, half-truths, and the gnawing sense that her life has been built on a foundation of omissions, because for months Dante has hovered on the edges of her existence like a ghost with unfinished business, always watching, always intervening at just the right moment, always knowing too much yet saying too little, and tonight, after yet another confrontation that was supposed to be about Marcel's betrayal but has veered into something far more personal, Leslie finally turns and demands the truth, her voice cracking as she accuses Dante of manipulating her, of protecting her when she never asked to be protected, of knowing things about her mother that no one else alive should know, and Dante, normally so controlled, so infuriatingly calm, finally falters, his jaw tightening, his eyes darkening with a pain that looks far too old and far too deep to belong to a casual ally, and as Leslie presses him, listing every coincidence, every unexplained rescue, every time he seemed to anticipate her fear before she spoke it, Dante tries to deflect, telling her she's exhausted, that grief can make people see patterns that aren't there. But Leslie won't let it go, because something in her chest is screaming now, something primal and undeniable, and she throws out the question she's been afraid to ask since the day she first saw him standing at her mother's grave, asking him why he looked like he was mourning more than a friend, and that's when Dante finally breaks, because he realizes the lie has already collapsed under its own weight, and in a voice barely above a whisper, a voice rough with decades of restraint, he says the 5 words he has rehearsed and feared and sworn he would never utter, the 5 words that slice through Leslie's reality like lightning through a storm-dark sky. Your mother loved the ocean. And in that instant, the room seems to tilt, the air rushing from Leslie's lungs as the words echo again and again in her mind, because no one alive knows that, no one except her, because it wasn't written in journals or shared with friends, because her mother told her that in a moment so private and tender it felt sacred. A childhood memory of sitting barefoot on a cold beach while her mother braided her hair and spoke softly about the ocean being the only place she ever felt brave, and Leslie remembers how her mother made her promise never to tell anyone, saying some loves are too fragile for the world, and now Dante has just shattered the last defense Leslie had against the truth, because the way he said it wasn't casual or inquisitive, it was intimate, weighted with longing and loss, spoken like a memory he had lived rather than been told, and Leslie's knees nearly buckle as she stares at him, the pieces of her life rearranging themselves with terrifying clarity, the years of absence, the unanswered questions about why her birth certificate listed a name that never appeared again, why her mother refused to speak of the man who left, why there was always a shadow of sadness behind her smiles whenever Leslie asked about her father, and Dante, seeing the realization dawn on Leslie's face, reaches for her instinctively, stopping himself just short of touching her, because he knows that one step could either steady her or destroy what little balance she has left, and Leslie, barely breathing now, asks him how he knows that, even though she already knows the answer, and Dante's silence is louder than any confession, because it confirms everything her heart has just screamed at her, and when he finally speaks again, his voice cracks as he admits that the ocean was where he and her mother planned to run away together, where they dreamed of a life beyond the lies and power games of Fairmont Crest, where they believed love could survive without secrecy, and Leslie feels anger surge alongside the shock, anger at the years stolen, at the man standing in front of her who chose distance over truth, and she lashes out, accusing him of cowardice, of abandoning them, of letting her grow up believing she was unwanted, and Dante accepts every word without defense, because he knows he earned them, confessing that he was forced to choose between exposing a dangerous truth that would have destroyed them both or walking away to keep them safe, a choice he regrets every day, and as the weight of that confession settles, Leslie's emotions spiral, grief for the father she never knew colliding with fury at the father who is always watching from afar, and she demands to know why now, why he's come back into her life when the damage is already done, and Dante tells her the truth again, that Marcel was never just a betrayer but a threat, that Leslie was being maneuvered into a trap designed years ago, and that Dante couldn't stay in the shadows any longer, because losing her would have been a loss he could not survive, and that admission hits Leslie harder than anything else, because for the first time she sees not a manipulator, or an ally, or a mystery, but a man terrified of losing his child, and the room fills with an unbearable silence broken only by Leslie's uneven breathing as she processes the reality that her entire identity has shifted in the span of 5 words, and outside, unseen, the repercussions are already spreading through Fairmont Crest, because this revelation doesn't just rewrite Leslie's past, it threatens to expose long-buried alliances, secrets tied to inheritance, and a lineage that could upend power dynamics across the gates. And as Leslie finally speaks again, her voice steadying with a resolve that mirrors her mother's quiet strength, she tells Dante that 5 words don't make a father, that truth without accountability means nothing, but she also admits that she can't unhear what he said, can't unknow what her heart recognized the moment he spoke it, and Dante nods, tears slipping freely now, accepting whatever distance Leslie needs, because for him, saying those 5 words was never about claiming her, it was about honoring the woman they both loved. And as Leslie turns away, needing space, needing time, needing to rebuild herself from the ashes of a lie that spanned her entire life, she pauses at the doorway and looks back at Dante, seeing not just the man who broke her world open, but the man whose blood runs in her veins, and she tells him that if he wants a place in her life, it will have to be earned, slowly and painfully, and Dante agrees without hesitation, because for the first time, he's not hiding, and as Leslie steps into the night, the legacy of those 5 words lingers like a promise and a warning, signaling that beyond the gates, nothing stays buried forever, and the truth, once spoken, changes everything. And the aftermath of those 5 words does not fade quietly into the background, but detonates across Fairmont Crest with a slow, merciless burn that only the deepest truths carry, because the moment Leslie leaves that room, the realization continues to metastasize inside her, replaying every memory she has ever had of Dante through a new and devastating lens, every glance that lingered too long, every warning that felt personal rather than strategic, every time he appeared just when she was about to fall apart, and as she drives aimlessly through the city, the streets blurring with unshed tears, Leslie is forced to confront the brutal truth that her life has never been entirely her own, that invisible hands have been shaping her path for decades, and that the man she once suspected of manipulation was, in his own fractured way, trying to be a father from the shadows. A realization that sickens and softens her all at once, because understanding does not erase abandonment, and forgiveness feels impossibly far away, especially when she begins to connect the dots between Dante's silence and her mother's quiet sacrifices, remembering how her mother worked herself to exhaustion, yet never spoke bitterly of the past, how she always insisted Leslie be brave, be independent, be prepared to stand alone, and now Leslie understands that those lessons were born from love and loss intertwined, that her mother was raising her to survive a world that had already proven it could be cruel, and this knowledge hardens Leslie's resolve, because if her life has been shaped by secrets, she will no longer allow secrets to define her future, and back at the estate, Dante is left alone with the echo of his confession, collapsing into a chair as decades of restraint finally give way, knowing he has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, knowing that his enemies will not hesitate to exploit this newfound vulnerability once they sense the shift, and sure enough, elsewhere, Marcel feels the tremor before he hears the details, sensing that Dante has broken his own rules, that Leslie now knows more than she should, and Marcel smiles thinly, because information has always been his currency, and a father's love is the easiest leverage of all. While other players within the gates begin to notice Leslie's sudden distance, her sharper edge, the way she now watches everyone as if weighing their worth, and whispers start to circulate about Dante's true connection to her, whispers that threaten to unearth long-buried contracts, inheritance clauses, and power structures that were never meant to intersect, and Leslie, refusing to be hunted or handled, makes a decisive move of her own by seeking out the one person who might know more about her mother's final years than anyone else still alive, setting the stage for revelations that could either validate Dante's choices or expose him as yet another architect of her pain. And when Leslie finally confronts Dante again days later, the air between them is different, heavier but clearer, because the lie is gone, replaced by a fragile, volatile truth, and Leslie lays down boundaries with a strength that unmistakably echoes her mother's spirit, telling Dante that she will decide what their relationship becomes, that blood does not entitle him to her trust, and that if he lies again, even once, she will walk away forever. And Dante accepts this without argument, because for the first time in his life, he understands that being her father means surrendering control, not wielding it, and as their uneasy truce forms, Beyond the Gates shifts irrevocably, because 5 words have not only rewritten Leslie's past but ignited a future filled with reckoning, revenge, and the dangerous possibility of redemption. And as the walls of Fairmont Crest close in around its inhabitants, one truth becomes inescapable. The secrets that were meant to protect Leslie may now be the very things that place her in the greatest danger of all. And yet the story does not slow, it deepens, because Leslie's awakening is not a moment, but a transformation, one that ripples outward and forces every relationship she touches to reveal its fractures. And in the days that follow, she begins to notice how people speak differently around her now, how questions trail off unfinished, how glances are exchanged when her name is mentioned in rooms she hasn't entered yet. And it becomes painfully clear that her identity has always been a quiet variable in equations of power she never consented to be part of, and that realization fuels a fire inside her that even grief cannot extinguish, because Leslie refuses to be reduced to a secret child or a bargaining chip, and when she finally confronts the legacy of her mother's silence head-on, she uncovers layers of sacrifice that make her ache with both pride and sorrow, learning that her mother walked away from comfort, influence, and protection to give Leslie a life unentangled from the cruelty of Fairmont Crest, a decision that now feels tragically ironic. Because no matter how far she ran, the Gates still found their way back to Leslie, and this knowledge reframes Dante yet again, not as the sole architect of her pain, but as a man trapped between devotion and fear, a man who believed distance was the only shield he could offer, and while Leslie refuses to absolve him, she can no longer deny the love that bled through his choices in imperfect, damaging ways. And that tension becomes the axis on which their future spins, especially when external threats begin to close in, because Marcel's interest sharpens into something predatory once he confirms the truth, recognizing that Leslie's lineage could dismantle alliances and rewrite inheritances he has spent years manipulating, and suddenly accidents become too well-timed, warnings too cryptic, and Leslie understands with chilling clarity that knowing who her father is has made her more visible, not safer, forcing Dante to step into the open in ways he has avoided his entire life, aligning himself publicly with her despite the risks, a move that sends shockwaves through Fairmont Crest and signals to every power broker watching that the rules are changing. And Leslie, watching Dante choose exposure over secrecy at last, feels something inside her loosen just enough to allow cautious hope, though she guards it fiercely, because trust is not rebuilt in grand gestures but in consistency. And as father and daughter navigate this fragile new reality, they are forced to confront the possibility that healing may only come after everything else burns down, because Beyond the Gates has never rewarded honesty without demanding a price. And as Leslie stands stronger than she ever has, fully aware of who she is and where she comes from, one truth becomes unavoidable and terrifying all at once. Dante's 5 words did not just reveal her past. They marked the beginning of a war where blood, truth, and love will all be tested, and not everyone will survive what comes next. And even as that war begins to take shape, its first casualties are not bodies but illusions, because Leslie can no longer afford the comfort of believing that intentions matter more than outcomes. And this sharpened clarity changes the way she moves through Fairmont Crest, the way she listens, the way she speaks, the way she withholds pieces of herself that once came freely. And people notice, because power always senses when someone stops being naive, and it unsettles them, especially those who benefited from her uncertainty. And Dante, watching from a careful distance, he is slowly learning to dismantle, realizes that in telling Leslie the truth, he has not weakened her, but forged her into something formidable, something dangerously honest. And that realization both terrifies and awes him, because it mirrors the woman he loved. The woman who once stood on a windswept shoreline and told him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to live inside a lie. And Leslie, unknowingly echoing that same philosophy now, begins asking questions that no one wants to answer. Questions about money that moved without records, about favors repaid years too late to be coincidence, about names that appear in sealed files alongside her mother's, and every answer she uncovers tightens the net around those who thought the past was safely buried, forcing Dante to confront the uncomfortable truth that protecting Leslie may now require dismantling the very systems he once navigated to keep her safe. And this internal conflict reaches a breaking point when Leslie is threatened directly, not with violence but with exposure, with the promise that her mother's choices will be reinterpreted, twisted, and used to undermine everything Leslie is trying to build. And when Dante offers to handle it quietly, to make the problem disappear the way he always has, Leslie stops him cold, telling him that secrecy is what created this mess, that she will not inherit his fear along with his blood. And that moment marks a seismic shift in their dynamic, because for the first time Dante is not leading or shielding but following, learning what it means to respect the autonomy of the daughter he once watched from afar. And as Leslie steps into the spotlight willingly, daring anyone to weaponize her truth against her, she robs her enemies of their greatest advantage. Because in Beyond the Gates, secrets only have power while they remain hidden, and Leslie's refusal to be ashamed destabilizes alliances built on whispers and leverage, forcing Marcel and others like him to escalate their tactics, which in turn exposes them to scrutiny they cannot withstand. And as the walls begin to crack, Leslie feels the weight of her mother's legacy settle onto her shoulders, not as a burden but as a compass, guiding her toward a future that is honest even when it is painful. And Dante, standing beside her now in the open, understands that fatherhood is not proven by sacrifice alone but by growth, by the willingness to change when the truth demands it. And as the storm intensifies around them, one thing becomes undeniable. The 5 words Dante spoke were not the end of the secret, but the beginning of a reckoning that will redefine family, loyalty, and power beyond the gates, leaving everyone to choose whether they will cling to the lies that built them or risk everything to become something real.